Welcome to LinkAGES Connects. I'm Ashley Ardy Beck, a social impact consultant with LinkAGES, and I'm here today, it is my great honor to say, with Chandra Matthews with the NextFifty Initiative and Rachel B. Cohen with both LinkAGES and Aging Dynamics. We're here in the studio to talk about the changing landscape of philanthropy and how some people are doing things differently so that we can have a greater impact together. So welcome.
Thank you.
Why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourselves?
Sure. My name is Chandra Matthews. I'm the Director of Programs at NextFifty Initiative. I've spent my career dedicated to improving the lives of older adults and have worked in a variety of different venues within that. I'm a social worker by education, so I've done direct social work practice as well as advocacy on behalf of older adults. And I've worked in different federal and state funding programs, and now obviously with NextFifty Initiative, I'm part of a private foundation.
So your whole life has been dedicated to helping older adults live better lives.
Career, yes.
Wow. And where does that passion come from?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say I grew up with all four of my grandparents, my mom's parents and my dad's parents, and just had a real affinity for my mom's dad in particular. And he taught me a lot about understanding a person's history and where they came from. I think people are nervous sometimes around older adults and don't know how to act or talk, and it was just all so very natural to me. And as I started working with the population, that affinity for that group just continued to grow, and wanting to ensure that people as they age have the same access to dignity and care and respect that we all want throughout our lives.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. I grew up with my grandparents as well and really never even imagined life not intergenerationally.
Yeah.
So thank you for the work you do.
Thank you.
And Rachel, tell us about your work.
Sure. So I'm the founder and CEO of Aging Dynamics consulting firm, and we specialize in age-friendly communities and work across the country doing strategic planning and facilitation and community engagement. And a big piece of that is a focus on intergenerational connections, and that's where LinkAGES comes in. So I'm the executive director of LinkAGES, which is an initiative dedicated to addressing social isolation by creating meaningful connections across generations. And we do that by increasing the capacity of organizations and communities to offer high quality programming. So it all dovetails.
Wonderful. And what led you to the path that you're on? I know you've worked a lot in social impact, but also have been really focused on multi-sector collaboration the whole way through. And now you're applying, or you've been applying that to the aging space. Is there something that drew you that way?
Yeah, so I'm also a social worker and a community planner. So for me, I've always looked at the world as people and place. And so communities are always at the forefront, and communities are about all different dimensions of our lives. And so that's where the multi-sector piece comes in, but also the intergenerational piece, because a healthy community has one where people of all ages are connected, they're supporting each other, they have all different opportunities to interact. And so for me, it's just bringing all of it together, but we can't do that by working in silos. And so I have dedicated my career to working across housing and public health and healthcare and social services, aging and youth-oriented, all as a way to help each of my clients and each organization learn how to work with others. And that's where the collaborative comes into play.
Okay, so I'd love to zero in on NextFifty as the director of programs. You have been there since 2020. I think you said July 2020. And that's kind of a long time for NextFifty because it's a relatively young organization. And can you tell us the history about NextFifty and how you've zeroed in on your mission and vision in Colorado?
So NextFifty Initiative was formed in 2016 through the sale of a nonprofit PACE provider, InnovatOrs. And as part of our kind of formation, we're completely separate. We operate independent of InnovatOrs now and have since our inception, but we kept that focus on and commitment to an older adult population that is primarily who they serve. And then part of the formation also expected that 80% of our corpus and any investment income would be restricted to benefit the lives of older adults in Colorado, and then 20% is unrestricted. So a lot of it was sort of told to us, I guess, who we would serve, but it's perfectly aligned with my own personal and professional mission, so it works out.
Very cool. And LinkAGES itself is rooted in Colorado. Can you tell us a little bit about how LinkAGES plays in the same space as NextFifty?
Yeah, we're very much tied. So LinkAGES was established, like I said, to be able to create more high quality intergenerational programs. So really based on the ideal of creating a culture of respect for older adults and doing that by bringing the generations together. So we formed in Metro Denver about 5 years ago and have continued to grow in Metro Denver, and now are also starting to reach across the country as more and more organizations are coming to us saying, help us do intergenerational programs, help us learn what you've been doing in Denver.
So I just want to pause right here for a second, because we keep mentioning the term intergenerational and intergenerational connections. Can we get a definition of that from you, Rachel? Sure. And why it matters?
Well, the way we look at it in LinkAGES is that we're talking about 2 generations with a skipped generation. So technically you could have 3 or 4, but you have a skipped generation. The reason for that is that you move away from a familial dynamic. So even if you're not family, what tends to happen is if you've got 2 generations right next to each other, that dynamic just naturally happens. So through LinkAGES, what we're looking for is those connections across broader generations.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so we asked you here today, Chandra, because NextFifty is a really innovative funding organization. You're looking at things not one time, not 2 times, but continuously learning. And what is the ethos behind NextFifty's strategy as it approaches funding in the aging space?
You know, I think since inception, NextFifty has really prided itself on being a learning organization. And when we started, we had a pretty heavy emphasis on innovative programs, wanting to find new and different ways not only to serve older adults, but to advance longevity in the aging space. And that really helped us learn and grow, and it allowed us to understand what was happening in the aging space in Colorado and beyond. And as we started to fund more and get more connected to the community, we obviously started listening to the community more and more and understanding the ways in which our funding had an impact or didn't have an impact, and really wanted to lean into what are the types of things that we ought to be doing as a funder that would really help organizations improve the lives of older adults, ultimately what we want to accomplish. And so I think it's just been in our, like, who we are, when we were created. We just want to learn and evolve and grow based on not only that external sort of input, but also what are we learning internally from funding opportunities? Are we accomplishing the goals we set out to? What can help inform what we do next?
That's so fun. It must be a very dynamic environment to be working in.
Very much so, yes.
It also sounds, like you're creating a different type of relationship with your grantees from what I can glean. How do you like to work with your grantees?
I don't know that there's any set definition for how we work with grantees. I think, one, it depends on the funding opportunity and the expectations associated with that funding opportunity. But in general, we want to take our cues from them. If they want us as a thought partner, as part of their grant, we're happy to be at a table and be included in those conversations. We're also happy to just leave people alone and let them do their good work and trust that they know what they're doing and why they're doing it and how to do it. And so I would say in general, our philosophy is to just kind of take those cues from our grantees and really work to understand what helps them do the best work possible. And if that's having us a little more involved, we're happy to be, and we're also happy to just stay out of the way.
Very cool. And Rachel, would you say, like, you've been in the field for 25 plus years, you've been a grantee, been a funder, been a funding consultant. Would you say that this is like a traditional funding approach, or how would you contextualize it in the larger landscape of funding?
No, and I say this not just because I'm sitting next to Chandra. No, I think that one of the things I have admired about NextFifty is that it's not the traditional funding approach. So we have some real barriers with our traditional funding in the sense of oftentimes it's one age group is funded. It's very prescriptive in terms of the types of programming or how we're going to do it. There's limited funding timelines as well. So a lot of the work that we're doing, there may be a requirement for collaboration, but there's not the time and support that's needed to actually develop a very high functioning collaborative. And there's also this challenge when you have the prescriptive guidelines that the funding itself doesn't allow you to find your way. You may have an idea, you may think something's going to go in one direction, and then things happen. Pandemics happen, partners go out of business, partnerships don't work. You need to have that fluidity. And it is one of the things that I admire about NextFifty is that as you guys have developed over the last 6 years now, the learning approach is really paying off, at least from the outside perspective, because you're trying different things. You're trying flexible funding. I've had the personal experience through LinkAGES being funded by NextFifty, of being able to come and say, hey, this just shifted, and have our program officer and Chandra be able to say, okay, how can we support? What can we do? And having that flexibility, even though our grant wasn't a flexible funding grant, it acts like that. And it makes a huge difference in terms of being able to create impact and really find your way in changing times.
Yeah, that trust-based philanthropy where you're building relationships over time that can be sustained also can have a huge impact on a community over time because you aren't in that scarcity or that fearful mindset like nobody cares, that funder doesn't think this program's sexy enough, or like the hierarchy of influence. So I've really enjoyed working with NextFifty. It's nice humans working with humans to make the world better. It seems to be what we should all be focused on. So I'd love to look forward to your strategic plan. I know you were just going through one of your learning processes, but I'm also wanting to look back a little bit. What have you learned so far that has informed the future?
Oh, well, so much. And like I said, when we first started funding our general fund, which I think LinkAGES has an application through, was really focused on innovation. And I would say as an organization, we still want to find innovative approaches to serving older adults or innovative ways to look at aging and longevity because it's important to have someone considering that. But it's also very important to consider older adults have basic needs that need to be met. And so as we were funding and we started to fund in different areas, we were hearing from the community how hard it is sometimes to be innovative, right? And they didn't have the capacity, especially in some of the small rural organizations or smaller organizations in rural parts of Colorado and other parts of the country. They just couldn't be innovative. They needed capacity. And so we started considering what can we do to help strengthen capacities of organizations, and that was how our Community Response Fund was established. And that was really designed to increase organizational capacity or meet one-time sort of immediate or more urgent types of needs. So that was one opportunity. We also really learned that things come up, right? The 2020 census came about, and we started hearing how important it was going to be to ensure that there was proper outreach to older adults. So we stood up a funding opportunity to help organizations do that outreach. And then COVID happened, and we were just like everyone else, learning constantly about what was needed and how we could support. We were able to get funding out the door very, very quickly just to help organizations sustain. We launched a general operating support opportunity that was really focused on organizations wholly mission aligned. But throughout that time, I think the world of philanthropy started to shift a little bit. We were part of those conversations and really just starting to hear how important flexible funding is. And how we viewed it was we can be flexible and support those basic needs and allow organizations to put the money where they believe they need it most. but we could also fund some innovative things and really learn and grow and understand and continue to do the important work that we had been doing. And so I think that just that leaning into community and listening a little bit more, I think we learned we can stand funding opportunities up pretty quickly to be responsive in certain ways, but really just better understanding what are the needs of older adults and who are the experts in determining that. Certainly we have a level of expertise internally, but listening to the people who are doing the programs externally and allowing them to inform our work as well. That's kind of how our strategy is built.
Wow. So nice to hear.
So nice to say.
I know, it must feel good to be part of that mission.
It does. It's amazing. Yeah, it's amazing.
Are you seeing other funders doing this?
There is a smattering that I've seen. It's been a nice shift. I think COVID absolutely pushed a lot of funders to think differently and to be a little bit more nimble. But what I'm starting to see is more of that shift back. So moving away from the flexible, away from those short and easier, application processes, back into the much more complex, the much more very specific guidelines. It's also seeing a decrease in the funding that's available. So a lot of the organizations I work with went from being really flush for the 2 years, 2020 and 2021, and coming into now 2022 and looking forward, and we're really shifting back into that scarcity mindset, and with funders also feeling that tightness, right, from other economic conditions and all of that. It's starting to play into a really challenging environment. And I know as many of my clients and for LinkAGES, as we're looking for funding, we're kind of back in that zone of sort of holding our breath again. It's disappointing. I'm still hopeful though. Still hopeful that as more reports about the impact of different ways of doing funding, that we're going to really see that shift long term.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. This is off script, but just hearing you speak and then in response, do you feel a lot of pressure? Because there's not a lot of people funding positive aging or like the space of older adults. Do you feel pressure?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, there was a recent study that came out through Candid. Well, not recent, I think it was in 2019. But throughout my career, historically, they had said, about 2% of all philanthropic dollars go towards aging programs. That's now less than 1%. So as of 2019, I don't know when that whole shift occurred, but less than 1% of philanthropic dollars from the largest foundations in our country go towards aging initiatives. And so there's tremendous pressure associated with that. And we don't have a corpus the size of some of the large health foundations, right? We don't have $20 million to give out every year. And so that is limited to some extent. But I think that one of the things since coming on board and just having the history I do in my career, I feel a real sense of obligation of looking at the ways in which we can impact the lives of older adults outside of just our grant making. Our board is very attuned to that as well. How are we investing, our corpus? We have to invest it anyway. We should really be looking at investments that are mission aligned, right, and supporting entrepreneurs who are really trying to advance the aging and longevity space. And so that's part of our strategy as well, is looking at the other ways in which we can have an impact. We'll always be a grant maker. I feel quite confident saying that, but what should we be doing in policy and advocacy, and what role can we have there in helping to shape the lives of not just this generation of older adults, but many generations to come? But also, how can we be a leader and really communicate the needs of older adults and the organizations serving older adults to other foundations, and sharing with them what we've learned and why it is so important. If we can do anything to increase resources coming to this space, that would be fantastic.
Mm-hmm. The idea of you sharing what you've learned to make it easier for people to fund in the same way, or to be inspired to fund in ways that more align with their vision, is phenomenal. And it kind of makes me think about LinkAGES, because LinkAGES has been a really innovative format and since the beginning, but you're even innovating now and thinking differently about how you can expand. Rachel, I'd love for you, who as a funder as well, to speak to what does innovation mean? Like, what are we even saying when we keep mentioning innovative organizations, and what's the criteria? And then how is LinkAGES looking at having a larger impact with the same amount of resources, basically?
So I guess it's multi-part, multifaceted. One piece is similar to NextFifty, it's about learning. And so when LinkAGES was established with a collaborative at the center and a supportive backbone around it that provided all the technical assistance needed to remove barriers to intergenerational programs. We intentionally created it that way because we know that there are common barriers. But we also know that there's a variety of ways of getting around, under, and through those barriers. And we wanted to learn as we went through evaluation, through just having very frank and open and honest conversations, which required building trust, and then share that. And so that piece, as we had programming dollars to provide, we were trying things. And I think that with innovation, it's about trying, failing, learning, and trying again. And that has been the hallmark of LinkAGES since day one. And it's really paid off. And so while you may look at a program and say, oh, that's so simple, you brought in preschoolers, their caregiver, and nursing home residents, that's been happening for decades, right? And you're right, it has. However, what's innovative is us saying, let's try different music therapy modalities. Let's try it, pre-COVID it was in person, then it went online. What does that mean technology-wise? What's working, what's not working, and continually adapting it. That's where we find the innovation. It doesn't always look like a shiny product on a shelf when we're talking about humans, but with humans, it's where is that greater impact? And so what we've had to do is get creative. So not only get creative with our members, but also as we're looking at funding and we're looking at sustainability going forward, it's how do you bring in additional dollars? We never want to have a single funder, ever. And so for LinkAGES, it's looking at, all right, we're going to build an online hub, which is being supported by NextFifty, but then we're going to build additional products that we can sell, so that we can bring in dollars for, say, trainings and toolkits, always keeping in mind equity. That's really important to us. So wherever that price point is, it is accessible. But it's also saying, great, now we can tap into additional revenue and funding sources. And that's critical in terms of being able to continue doing this good work. Because when we look at our evaluation data, it's a no-brainer. Like, it's working. We're building capacity of organizations, we're expanding programs, and we're bringing in more people, particularly older adults who have been isolated and youth who are experiencing increasing amounts of loneliness. And so when you see all that impact, you have to keep getting creative in how you bring those dollars in.
I'd love to expand a little bit on the toolkits and the resources and the educational hub that you mentioned, because yes, it's so important to think about different ways that we can bring resources in, especially when we see another economic downturn, and to take off pressure from our dear friends at NextFifty and the 1% of funding that goes to older adults. So how do you see the educational hub creating a bridge for other communities?
Yeah. The educational hub really came out of a lot of requests that we've been getting across the country from organizations, really wanting to tap into what we've learned and all of our resources, and it grew from there. So we see the educational hub, which will be online, and we'll have a dynamic community component behind it. So it'll look like a website in the front with a whole bunch of resources, and then in the back are going to be places to create little virtual communities. And we see this both on an individual participant level. So during, say, any given program, so we have a photography program where we have undergrads and older adults coming together. They'll be able to continue to connect in their own little space in the hub after the program. We are also able to continue to grow those little communities. So as other people come in and say, I'm really interested in intergenerational photography, I want to meet other people, it's going to be that online home. then it's also the hub for organizations. So those are the requests that we get across the country. So our goal with creating this hub is to be able to have little cohorts in there. So those that are interested in art, those that are interested in music or food, other family histories, any of that, they'll be able to find other peer organizations that also have the same interests. We will, as we have always done with LinkAGES, wrap around it the technical assistance. So there'll be Ask a Coach sessions, there will be office hours, there will be an ongoing frequently asked questions, because a lot of the questions are the same. And then we'll have trainings, the toolkits will be available on there, all of our videos, we're doing a whole evaluation series. Again, getting at all the tough parts of doing intergenerational programming. So the evaluation series, for instance, breaks down the scariness of doing a program evaluation into 5 different videos. And it's a request I get all the time. It's one of the hardest things to fund is the evaluation, not one of the hardest, but it's in the list, is evaluation. And so again, we're trying to simplify it and share everything that we've learned so that others continue to grow. And then the idea of taking it from a collaborative that's only based in Metro Denver to this network, to this broader family, that's where we see increasing momentum. That's where we can touch hundreds and hundreds of organizations and they can learn from each other. That's been a huge benefit of LinkAGES, but it doesn't have to stay at a single table. It can go further than that. And it's something that doesn't exist right now in the sector. There's plenty of program lists and there are toolkits that are out there, but what's not out there is this supportive community hub, this place to go to learn together, to try different things again, fail, try again. And that's what we're creating.
I love that too, because it helps like a small organization in a rural place be innovative for very little effort on their part. They can pick up a toolkit, they can speak to somebody at another community, and you can do an online or a hybrid or an in-person for much lower input and risk, Okay, so speaking of evaluation and learning and adapting, we're all dying to know what NextFifty has learned and how you're applying it towards your future goals. What's the strategy moving forward?
It really is to diversify, how we're using our resources. And so not just looking at grant making, but certainly diversifying grant making opportunities for organizations. Historically, we funded sort of 2 main funding cycles each year, similar in how they were set up. When we started incorporating other sort of, not spur of the moment, but some of those more spur of the moment opportunities. Responsive, exactly, great word. We diversified a little bit. And so you'll see that in this new strategy is we're really wanting to look at how do we improve the lives of older adults? How do we strengthen the capacity of organizations operating in this space? How do we really solicit innovative projects that help advance longevity? And how do we reduce ageism? So looking at those as our overarching goals, what are the things that we can put into place? And so it really is about direct grants and continuing to be a grant maker, exploring opportunities for how to invest our funds, looking at systemic change and operating in this policy and advocacy space. What role do we play there? And also sharing learnings, right? Communicating all of this information out, convening partners around the table, making those connections, creating collaborations, but also bringing funders together who are in this space, learning how we might be able to leverage the dollars that we each have to support various initiatives, and bringing funders who aren't in this space back to the table to say, let's talk more about this. And so I think what you'll see is diversity in our grant making opportunities and in how we really deploy capital over the next couple years.
So when we talk about funding collaboration and funders getting together and funding collaboratively, Rachel, do you have any thoughts on like how can funders who maybe are still in a traditional funding mindset see the power behind meeting NextFifty, sitting down, sharing resources, and then also funding not just one organization, but several to work together?
Yeah, there's definitely historically been some models where funders have gotten together around various initiatives like technology or education. So there's definitely things to look at that exist. I think that one of the keys is to be able to have the data to say, here's why we should do this. And the fun part is aligning everybody's mission and everybody's funding priorities and everybody's processes, but aligning it around that common goal, and really being able to say, okay, if we do this, we're really going to have that impact. It was part of the initial strategic plan actually for LinkAGES. We haven't gotten to that point yet, but was to create a funders collaborative that was focused on intergenerational funding, because I think that probably falls even less than that terrible less than 1% for older adults is the intergenerational piece. And I think that it lends itself even better to bringing multiple funders to the table. There's definitely a challenge when we're talking about a traditional funder that hasn't necessarily collaborated with others. And it takes time, and it's going to take, I think, a lot of education to be able to see how that impact can play out, especially when we really only fund in a silo. I think it's a worthy challenge. It is one we are excited about, being able to contribute some of that knowledge to, and happy to help.
I want to bring us back a moment because we keep bringing up data and evaluation and adapting, and I know that everyone has these huge diversity, equity, and inclusion goals, and these huge goals are often difficult to achieve very quickly. But NextFifty has just published your demographic survey, is that correct? Results. Can you tell us a little bit about what you learned and how you'll apply that knowledge?
Sure. Well, I think primarily we learned we aren't really reaching a very diverse demographic with our funding. We learned that, saying applications are strengthened by targeting underserved communities isn't enough to really get organizations who are serving more diverse communities. And so we know we need to be intentional in our funding, and we really want to advance equity in the aging space by supporting initiatives that honor intersectional identities of older adults and acknowledge that those intersectional identities impact the way people age and access care. So I think we've learned that through the survey, but we've also just learned it over time that what you'll see in the coming years is a much more intentional approach to reaching a more diverse demographic, but also reaching out to organizations that have not historically been connected to us. How do we get into community? How do we engage more? And really get applications from organizations who are embedded in diverse communities and make sure we're supporting them.
I love that approach. Is this all data based off of a survey of your grantees?
It was a survey from the grantees, so that we asked them to complete the information in terms of what percentage of certain populations did they serve. So it was all from them. We haven't historically asked for demographic data, so it was kind of this look back and from their perspective.
We've been writing grants and going through the same experience at LinkAGES because historically you didn't ask that question, and now we all know that being colorblind serves nobody. And so it's this shift, like we have to ask because we won't know if we're moving the needle unless we ask. And also finding that community voice. So Rachel, I know that you have just integrated a new program into LinkAGES, and there is an opportunity here to receive the perspective of the community hands-on. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you're including, or there's multiple programs, how you're including the community voice and community perspective from communities you have not historically worked with through LinkAGES?
Yeah, this is definitely a big priority for us. And it's also, just as we've always done with LinkAGES, it's about curiosity and asking questions and never assuming that we know the exact path. That's part of, I would say, our ethos. And so one of the programs, it's called Stitching the Quilt, which is a partnership with actually another NextFifty grantee, Herbal Gardens Wellness, which is an organization that works with Native and Indigenous communities. We entered into conversation to say, we are interested in intergenerational connections. We're interested in, how that can address isolation. What does that look like from a Native and Indigenous perspective? How can we get curious and create supported communication? Because we never want to bring a program to a community in a box and say, here, this worked in this community, it's going to work with you. People look at connection differently, intergenerational differently, family dynamics are different, family structures, history, all of this stuff plays into it. And we just don't want to assume. So we created the Stitching the Quilt program, which matches Native elders with, right now we have 4 Native elders and 8 participants that are non-Native. And we come together over a series of 5 sessions. They're all highly facilitated and intended to help us learn about each other and also develop that open communication. The end result of it will be exploring, because it has to be about intergenerational for us. So it's really exploring what would an intergenerational program look like that would respect and honor the variety of cultures, because it's not just one Native culture, and how can we do that together? So we started Stitching the Quilt just a couple of months ago, and it's a 5-part program that'll end in the spring, and it will culminate in the creation of a new intergenerational program that will honor and respect the variety of heritage that we will have talked about through our program. So we're very excited about that. Again, it's a time to be open and humble and just listen. The connections that have already started forming after the first 2 sessions are really amazing. And it's one way that we, again, are able to bring what we're learning and work with other communities and not just say, here's how you have to do it. So the other program where we're actively involving the community in planning and evaluating is the Collective Healing Through Art program, which brings together youth and older adults around different arts programming to build resilience and emotional support. One of the things that we are looking to do in the next year is actually create an intergenerational council so that we will have youth participants and older adult participants coming together to design the programs. They won't have to do the heavy lifting, but we are looking to them to say, here's what we'd be interested in doing, and here's how we want to connect with others and what we find interesting, and also encouraging them to build some leadership skills as well. So there's always a lot of layers, but that's one piece where we really want to be intentional about listening to others' voices as well.
In the community healing, collective healing through arts, is that predominantly in Black neighborhoods in Denver?
Yes, so far it has been mostly focused on neighborhoods that tend to have a lower income threshold and are also primarily Black.
Excellent. And moving forward, I think I would also love to share with the audience that CHTA is forming affinity groups as well for other demographics. So it's kind of exciting because it's not us guessing. It's just involving people in conversation and then letting them lead the way, which I think is so exciting in today's world. Okay, so do you have any advice, Chandra, for maybe it's like a director of programs or somebody who's within a position of influence in a funding organization? Do you have any advice for them if they're considering this like relationship-based or trust-based philanthropy model?
Oh, sure. There's tons of resources out there. There's an organization called the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project, which just has a ton of information. And one of the biggest things that I've learned through that organization and through various training opportunities and webinars is this isn't an all or nothing situation, right? You can decide what works for your organizations and lean into that trust. And so I don't think organizations need to feel like they need to do all of these things in order to be considered trust-based. They need to do what works for them. But really, trust-based philanthropy is about leaning into your values as an organization and keeping your values at the core of every decision made, both internally and externally. And organizations want to lean into their values. And so I think it also just takes, I think the gumption to say, there are experts in the community who maybe even know a little bit more than we know, and we should listen to them. And so I encourage people to explore it and not to feel intimidated by it. And again, not to feel like we have to check all of these boxes in order to do it. You can do what makes sense for your organization, and that's very much how the NextFifty Initiative is approaching it. And so I think that would be my advice.
That's great advice. Bite size. Take as much as you can take. Okay, so on the other side, the funding world can feel like kind of dog eat dog, right? Like as a community-based organization or someone seeking funding, it can feel like you're very desperate sometimes for funds and you'll just apply to whatever's available. Do you have any advice, Rachel, for people seeking funding about how to choose the right opportunities?
Yeah, it's really important not to chase the money. And I've seen way too many organizations that form themselves around a funding opportunity, and that's not sustainable, and it doesn't help anyone. The best way to do it is to get really clear on, as Chandra was saying, like, what are your values? What, as an organization, what is that mission? What are you trying to change in the world? And then find the funder that aligns with you. Find that funding opportunity that's going to support you doing things the way that you know they need to be done. Not to say you aren't going to take advice or have a thought partner, but that's the beauty of the organization, or what you're assuming is that they know what they're doing, right? And so being able to be really strategic about those funding opportunities. You always want the funder that fits. It's got to go both ways.
Like all good relationships. So do either of you have any parting words for our audience?
Well, I just want to thank Rachel for this opportunity. It's fun to sit down and talk a little bit, not only about what's happening at LinkAGES, but how NextFifty is operating in this space. And thank you for your time as well.
Oh my gosh, it's my pleasure. It's fun. This is a fun conversation because, obviously probably everyone who interviews anyone imagines it this way, but you are just choosing people who are experts and open and can really speak to the whole dimension of what you're talking about. So it's fun having the two of you speak. Any parting words?
I would just say the way that we're going to have the greatest impact is to surround ourselves with like-minded folks. You don't have to think the same thing, but who are committed to that same vision. Having that diversity of perspectives helps, and it's lovely to be able to have, Chandra and I have known each other for many years and across many different organizations, but it's always just great to be able to talk like colleagues and say, hey, what can we do together? And I think that if any of us are really going to achieve those missions, we have to do it collaboratively.
I love that. Well, thank you both for sitting down with me today. I've had a blast, and this is LinkAGES Connects.